Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's story. A scream pierces the night at Pembroke Castle in January 1457. Not the cry of war, but of a 13-year-old girl forced into labor too soon. Her name is Margaret Beaufort. She is fighting for her life and the life of the child within her. Who is this child? Why is this birth soaked in blood and fear? And how could it change the destiny of England forever? Stay with me until the end, because what begins as tragedy will give rise to the mighty Tudor dynasty.
The birth of a dynasty in blood. Picture this. A scream echoes through the corridors of Pembroke Castle on a frozen January night in 1457. The sound cuts across the stone walls, sharper than the sea wind howling against the cliffs. In a chamber lit only by flickering candles, a girl of 13 writhes on a blood-soaked bed. Her name is Margaret Beaufort, and she is not supposed to be here, not like this. She is still a child, her body unfinished, yet she is laboring to bring forth a son who will one day end a war and found a dynasty. The midwives whisper prayers in Latin, their words swallowed by the crackle of the hearth and the guttural cries of their young patient. Outside, the waves slam against Pembrokeshire's coast, relentless and cold, as though the world itself strains to witness what is happening inside these walls. Margaret's small hands clutch at the sheets until her knuckles whiten. Her dark hair, plastered to her forehead with sweat, frames a face locked between childhood fear and a queenly destiny she cannot yet imagine. This is no ordinary birth. It is a gamble with death. At 13, Margaret's hips are too narrow, her body too frail for the brutal demands of childbirth. Medieval medicine had no anesthesia, no surgical rescue worth the name. The only weapons in that room were herbs, whispered charms, and the stubborn will of a child forced into womanhood too soon. Every contraction threatens to kill both her and the infant inside her. And yet, amid the pain and the prayers, history itself waits to be born. The irony is bitter. The infant struggling to emerge into the world will grow into Henry Tudor, the boy who will rise against impossible odds to claim the throne of England as Henry VII. His crown will end the Wars of the Roses, a 30-year bloodbath between Lancaster and York. His line, the Tudors, will reshape the kingdom, usher in the English Renaissance, and give the world names like Elizabeth I and Henry VIII. But none of this is certain now. For the moment, there is only a girl who should be learning her letters, torn apart by labor that might very well kill her. The chamber reeks of smoke, sweat, and fear. The midwives burn rosemary and lavender, believing the herbs will purify the air and strengthen Margaret's failing body. A relic is brought in a fragment of cloth, said to have touched Street Margaret of Antioch, patron saint of childbirth. It is pressed against the girl's belly as her body convulses. The women murmur, Sancta Margareta, ora pro nobis. Saint Margaret, pray for us. Hours drag on like centuries. Margaret's screams fade into hoarse gasps, then into silence as exhaustion robs her of strength. The castle priest kneels in the chapel below, praying for a miracle. Jasper Tudor, her brother-in-law and protector, paces the halls outside, his boots echoing against the stones. He knows too well. If the girl dies, so dies the fragile hope of his family's future. And then after nearly a full day of torment, the room stills. A child is torn from Margaret's battered body, pale and silent. For a breathless moment, all is quiet, but the fires hiss. Then a cry pierces the chamber. Thin, defiant, alive. The midwife lifts the boy, blood and fluid dripping from his tiny body, and the world changes. Henry Tudor is alive. Margaret, nearly unconscious, turns her head weakly toward the sound. Her lips tremble in something between prayer and disbelief. The infant is pressed against her chest for a fleeting instant, his small warmth against her broken body, before he is taken away to be cleaned and swaddled. Margaret has given England its future king, but at a terrible price. Her body is torn, damaged beyond repair. She will never safely bear another child. In that instant, her motherhood both begins and ends. Few who heard that newborn's first cry could have guessed its significance. The nobles of England were too busy sharpening swords and gathering banners for the civil war that already raged across the land. Yet in that freezing castle chamber, with a child mother hovering between life and death, the seed of the Tudor dynasty had been sown. And so it begins, not with triumph, not with glory, but with agony. The story of Margaret Beaufort, the girl who suffered to give England a king. To understand how Margaret Beaufort found herself in that blood-soaked chamber at 13, we must go back to her earliest years, a childhood shadowed by death, duty, and the cold machinery of dynastic politics. Margaret was born around May 1443 into the powerful Beaufort line, descended from John of Gaunt, the fourth son of Edward III. Her blood carried both prestige and peril. In the 15th century, to be born of royal stock was to inherit not just privilege, but danger. That thread of Plantagenet blood running in her veins could make her either a bride of immense value or a target. Her father, John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, never saw her grow. A once promising commander in the waning years of the 100 Years' War, he had been entrusted with English forces in France. But the tide had turned. One by one, English strongholds fell back to the French crown. Each defeat gnawed at him like a poison of the spirit. When he returned to England in 1444, courtiers whispered of his hollow cheeks, his trembling hands, and the silence that clung to him. He spoke little, ate less, and seemed to fade before their eyes. By May of that year, John Beaufort was dead at just 41 years old. The official cause was fever, but no one believed it. Some said despair had driven him to take his own life, unwilling to live with the stain of military disgrace. Others muttered about poison, for in those turbulent years, the unexplained death of a noble was almost always laid at the feet of enemies. Whatever the truth, Margaret was left fatherless before her first birthday, her inheritance, both her greatest gift and her greatest curse. Her mother, Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe, knew exactly what had to be done. A widow in the 15th century could not waste time on grief. She moved swiftly, securing her daughter's future with contracts and alliances. For noblewomen, survival meant strategy, and children were bargaining chips. By the age of 6, little Margaret was already engaged. Her betrothal was to John de la Pole, the young heir to the Duke of Suffolk. To modern eyes, it seems grotesque, binding a child still playing in castle gardens to a future husband she had never met. But in the world of 15th century England, such contracts were weapons sharper than swords. For a time, the match looked unbreakable. Suffolk wielded immense influence, having arranged King Henry VI's controversial marriage to Margaret of Anjou. But in 1450, Suffolk fell from grace spectacularly. Branded a traitor for ceding the territories of Maine and Anjou to France, he was attacked while crossing the Channel. Dragged from his ship by pirates or political enemies masquerading as pirates, he was forced to kneel on the gunwale. The executioner's rusty sword hacked at his neck in clumsy strokes, leaving the sea foaming red before the final blow struck true. With Suffolk's fall, the alliance collapsed. Little Margaret's betrothal, so carefully arranged, became worthless parchment. She learned her first bitter lesson. In a world ruled by ambition, a girl's fate could shift overnight. And yet, she was not ordinary. From an early age, chroniclers noted her seriousness, her sharp mind, and her unwavering piety. Unlike many noble children raised in luxury, Margaret seemed always aware of the weight of expectation pressing on her. She prayed more than she played, listened more than she spoke. In a realm on the edge of civil war, she was already learning that silence and observation could be more powerful than laughter. It is tempting to picture her childhood as sheltered, filled with gardens and tapestries. But that is a fantasy. Margaret grew up in an England fraying at the seams, where whispers of rebellion drifted through corridors, and every noble household carried the scent of treachery. Her family's position was strong, but precarious. The blood of kings in her veins ensured she would never be allowed to live quietly. So when her first betrothal crumbled, another was swiftly arranged. This time to Edmund Tudor, half-brother of King Henry VI. It was not a choice of love, nor of comfort. It was strategy, pure and simple. The Tudors, though Welsh in origin and viewed with suspicion by the old nobility, had one priceless advantage: the king's favor. And in 15th century England, the king's favor was everything. Margaret was still only a child, but already the gears of destiny were turning. Her fate was sealed not by her wishes, but by the relentless demands of bloodlines, power, and survival. The girl who lost her father before she could remember him was about to be handed to a man twice her age, bound not by love, but by politics. And though she could not yet know it, that marriage would lead her to grief, widowhood, and the birth of a dynasty. By the mid-1452, England was a kingdom simmering towards civil war. The fragile Lancastrian crown rested on the head of Henry VI, a man pious, gentle, and disastrously unfit to rule. His court was a nest of rival factions, each clawing for power. In this unstable world, marriages were not private unions, but weapons, forged to secure loyalties and control bloodlines. It was in this furnace that 12-year-old Margaret Beaufort was wed to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond. Edmund was no mere noble. He and his brother Jasper were half-brothers of the king, born from the scandalous union of Owen Tudor, a Welsh courtier, and Catherine of Valois, widow of Henry V. Their mother had been a queen, their father little more than a servant, but Henry VI had legitimized them and elevated them to the peerage. To marry one of them was to bind yourself directly to the king's bloodline. For Margaret, it was not a choice. At 12, she was barely taller than the swords her new husband's retainers carried. She still wore the long braids of a child. Yet she was placed in a marriage bed with a man in his mid-20s, seasoned by politics and war. The ceremony at Pembroke Castle was splendid, with banners of the Beauforts and Tudors hanging side by side. But beneath the music and ritual was a brutal truth. This was no fairy tale. It was dynastic calculation. The marriage was consummated immediately. There was no waiting for Margaret's body to grow strong enough for motherhood. In an age when noble girls were prized as vessels for heirs, the question of health was secondary to the urgency of politics. Chroniclers say little about that night. Margaret herself never spoke of it. But silence often speaks louder than words. Modern historians believe the trauma of that forced consummation scarred her deeply, both physically and psychologically. She would never again be able to carry a child without risk. Yet, despite her suffering, Margaret learned quickly. She observed, she adapted. Her husband, though powerful, was often absent, campaigning in Wales to enforce royal authority. Margaret remained in Pembrokeshire, learning to navigate her new household, watching how alliances were made and broken in whispered conversations over firelit tables. She was even then training herself for survival. But fate was merciless. In 1456, Edmund Tudor was captured by Yorkist forces at Carmarthen Castle. England was already fracturing into the factions of York and Lancaster, the White Rose and the Red. Edmund, as the king's half-brother, was a target. Accounts differ on what happened next. Some say he succumbed to plague while imprisoned. Others whisper he was murdered, eliminated before he could be ransomed. What is certain is that by November 1456, Edmund Tudor was dead barely a year into his marriage. And so, at 13, Margaret found herself a widow, carrying the child of a man she had barely known, in a land already splintering with rebellion. Her future was once again uncertain, her survival dependent on the fragile alliances of others. She had left childhood behind long before most girls her age even thought of marriage. Now, she was to face motherhood alone. In the flicker of a candle, Margaret's fate shifted. What had begun as a dynastic arrangement would soon become one of the most consequential pregnancies in English history. For within her womb grew the last viable hope of the Lancastrian line. When word reached Margaret that Edmund Tudor was dead, she was not yet 13. Already a widow, already carrying his child, she stood at the edge of a future darker than she could comprehend. In an England torn by faction, a young landless widow was a pawn to be used or discarded. Her salvation came in the form of Jasper Tudor, Edmund's younger brother, who took her under his protection. Jasper was no ordinary guardian. He was fiercely loyal to the Lancastrian cause and deeply aware of the stakes. Margaret carried not just his brother's unborn child, but the fragile hope of their bloodline. To protect her was to protect the possibility of Lancastrian survival. He brought her to his stronghold at Pembroke Castle, a fortress of stone rising above the waters of Milford Haven in remote Wales. The journey there was perilous. It was winter, and the roads were little more than frozen ruts choked with ice and mud. Margaret, her body weakened by pregnancy, traveled in a covered litter jolting over uneven paths. Each bump sent waves of pain through her small frame. Servants and guards rode alongside, wary of brigands and rival factions that prowled the countryside. What should have been a short journey stretched into nearly a week, marked by storms, swollen rivers, and the ever-present threat of ambush. When Pembroke Castle finally loomed on the horizon, it was less a sanctuary than a stone cage. Built on a limestone promontory, its towers stood like clenched fists against the sea winds. The great keep soared nearly 80 feet high, its walls thick enough to withstand both siege and storm. For centuries, it had been a symbol of Welsh resilience. Now, it became the crucible in which Margaret's fate and England's future would be decided. Life within its walls was harsh. The castle's chambers were drafty, the cold so deep that ice formed on the inside of windows. Fires roared day and night, devouring wood faster than servants could carry it. Margaret's rooms were lined with heavy tapestries to block the gales, but still the sea air found its way through every crack. Pregnant and frail, she often lacked the strength even to walk across her chamber. The castle physician, Master Louis Carlion, a man trained in the traditions of Oxford and Paris, examined her with unease. Margaret's body, still that of a child, was not prepared for the burden it carried. Her hips were narrow, her bones not yet fully developed. The baby within her was large and positioned awkwardly. Carlion confided in Jasper Tudor that childbirth might kill her, yet what choice was there? To attempt an early delivery was impossible, and to do nothing was equally deadly. In hushed voices, the men considered the grim possibilities. The girl, the child, or both might be lost. Margaret herself bore the weight of these fears in silence. In the long Welsh nights, she turned increasingly to prayer. Her devotion, already strong, deepened into something almost obsessive. She spent hours in the chapel, her small figure kneeling on cold stone until her knees bled. She clung to relics, memorized Latin prayers, and pleaded with God to spare her child, if not herself. For her, religion was not comfort but survival, a way to give meaning to suffering that seemed otherwise unbearable. Yet Jasper Tudor, recognizing her sharp mind, also became her tutor in politics. In stolen hours, he taught her to read the unspoken language of power, how to measure men's loyalties, how to recognize ambition behind courtesy, how to survive in a court where smiles hid daggers. Even at 12, Margaret absorbed everything. She may have been powerless in body, but she began to sharpen her mind into the one weapon no one could take from her. Her attendants worried. They saw how quickly the girl's youth had been consumed by burden, widowhood, pregnancy, and fear. But Margaret never faltered outwardly. Beneath her frailty burned an iron will. She would endure. She would bring this child into the world. And so, as the winter of 1456 dragged into 1457, the stage was set. Within the cold walls of Pembroke, amid prayers and fears, the girl who had lost her father, her childhood, and her husband now prepared to risk her very life. Because in her womb lay the last flicker of Lancastrian hope, a child who, if he survived, might one day change the course of English history. January 1457. The winds off the Irish Sea howled against Pembroke's walls, rattling shutters and filling the corridors with the groan of old timbers. Inside, the fortress became a crucible of blood and faith. Margaret Beaufort's labor had begun. She was 13, her body too slight, her bones too narrow. What followed was less birth than battle. For 18 hours, the chamber resounded with her screams, echoing off the stone like the cries of a soul in purgatory. The midwives, women hardened by years of delivering both peasants and queens, saw the truth at once. A child was trying to give birth to a child. Nature had been forced too far. They burned herbs to cleanse the air. Lavender for calm, rosemary for strength, rue to ward off evil spirits. They whispered prayers to street. Margaret of Antioch, whose legend told of surviving the belly of a dragon. Relics were placed by the bed, holy water sprinkled, yet none of it could change the grim facts of flesh and bone. Margaret's hips were too small, the infant positioned badly. Every contraction threatened to tear her apart. The physician, Master Carlion, came and went, his face drawn. In quiet moments, he confessed to Jasper Tudor what no one dared say aloud. This girl might not live to see dawn. Her pulse grew thready, her skin waxen. At times she drifted in and out of consciousness, her lips forming prayers even as her body shook with exhaustion. Still, she clung to life. When her screams broke into hoarse whispers, the midwives urged her on, their voices fierce, almost commanding. Dame Gwen, the elder midwife, stayed at her side, massaging her belly, shifting her position, using every scrap of inherited wisdom to coax the child into the world. At last, in desperation, she performed the dreaded manual extraction, a brutal, dangerous procedure that risked killing both mother and infant. The chamber fell silent as the infant was pulled into the world, pale, limp. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. Then Dame Gwen cleared his throat and mouth, rubbed his chest, and a thin, ragged cry filled the room. Relief broke over the attendants like a wave. The child lived. Henry Tudor had arrived. Margaret, nearly senseless from pain and blood loss, heard that cry. Through a haze, she reached weakly toward the sound, her body broken but her soul still clinging to the one thing she had fought to protect. The baby was laid briefly on her chest, his warmth pressed against her, before being carried to the fire to be swaddled. In those fleeting seconds, her motherhood and her sacrifice became one. But the victory was bitter. Margaret had paid an irreversible price. The tearing and internal injuries were catastrophic. Master Carleon whispered grimly, she would never again bear a child. This single act of survival had made her both mother and barren woman in the same night. Her recovery was slow and uncertain. Fever swept her body, threatening to undo what courage had preserved. For weeks she lay in a twilight of pain, tended day and night by Dame Gwen, who spooned broth between her cracked lips and changed her bloodied sheets with hands that never trembled. Jasper Tudor kept vigil in the chapel, bargaining with God for both the child and the girl mother who had nearly died. Even when her body began to heal, her mind bore scars. Nightmares haunted her, visions of suffocation, of pain unending. She developed a trembling fear of touch, flinching from even her lady's gentle hands. Holding her son sometimes brought tears of love, sometimes waves of terror as memories of agony flooded back. Yet, out of this brokenness, something formidable began to take shape. Margaret realized with terrifying clarity that her son was everything. He was the reason she had lived, the embodiment of her suffering, and the vessel of her family's future. To protect him would become the singular purpose of her life. And outside the walls of Pembroke, the kingdom stirred. The Wars of the Roses had already begun to tear England apart. The White Rose of York, the Red Rose of Lancaster both claimed legitimacy, both hungered for the crown. And in Margaret's fragile arms lay the boy who would one day, against every odd, end that war. But no one could see that far ahead in 1457. For now, all anyone saw was a girl whose body had been shattered by birth, and a child whose first cry seemed almost miraculous. The world moved on, sharpening swords and raising banners. Yet in the stone womb of Pembroke Castle, history itself had drawn breath.
Margaret Beaufort survived her ordeal, but survival came at a price. She was no longer a child, and yet not fully a woman. Her body, permanently damaged, would never bear another child. The boy she had fought death to deliver was her one and only heir, and in him the fragile thread of the Lancastrian claim now rested. But England in the late 1452 was not a safe cradle for heirs. The kingdom was bleeding itself to death. The first open clash of the Wars of the Roses erupted at Albans in 1455, where Richard, Duke of York, raised his banner against Henry VI. The crown itself had become a prize of war. Armies marched under roses, white for York, red for Lancaster. Nobles who yesterday dined as allies now carved each other to pieces in muddy fields. In this chaos, Margaret's value lay not in her widowhood, but in her child. And so, barely recovered from childbirth, she was married again. In 1458, she became the wife of Sir Henry Stafford, younger son of the Duke of Buckingham. This marriage was no romantic tale, it was a calculated pact. Stafford leaned toward Yorkist sympathies, yet his name and estates gave Margaret security. He accepted that her son, young Henry Tudor, would remain under Jasper Tudor's guardianship in Wales. For Margaret, this was the only clause that mattered, her boy's safety. Her new life was quieter but shadowed by war. While Stafford played the dangerous game of shifting loyalties, Margaret learned to adapt. She ran estates, managed tenants, and sharpened her understanding of law and finance. More importantly, she began to weave a web of alliances through letters, conversations, and the subtle diplomacy that noblewomen wielded in a man's world. She learned when to speak, when to listen, and when to hide her thoughts behind silence. But the deepest wound of this second marriage was separation. Margaret's son, the fragile infant she had nearly died to deliver, did not grow up at her side. Instead, he was raised in Jasper Tudor's household, hidden away in the wild hills of Wales, where Lancastrian sympathies still lingered. She saw him only rarely, once or twice a year at most. Each meeting was brief, bittersweet, and closely watched. Margaret loved him fiercely, but she mothered him through letters, tokens, and prayers rather than daily care. The years passed, and the wars grew bloodier. In 1461, Palm Sunday at Towton, the largest and most brutal battle ever fought on English soil, the Lancastrian cause was shattered. An estimated 50,000 men fought in the snowstorm that day, and half lay dead by nightfall. Henry VI fled north, his queen Margaret of Anjou into exile in France. York's heir, Edward, claimed the crown as Edward IV. For Margaret, the news was devastating. Her son's birthright, the Lancastrian crown, seemed to vanish beneath a field of corpses. Yet Margaret endured. She watched as Henry VI was captured, released, and captured again, as Edward IV's fortunes rose and fell. She watched queens barter with kings, noble houses rise and collapse. And through it all, she thought only of one thing: her boy in Wales. Henry grew into a quiet, observant child. Under Jasper's guardianship, he was taught not only the manners of a nobleman, riding, hunting, swordsmanship, but also the language of survival. He learned Welsh fluently, winning the loyalty of the local gentry. He listened to stories of his father and of the Beaufort bloodline that pulsed through him. He was raised to know he was more than just another orphaned lord. He was a prince in waiting, a symbol of hope for the Red Rose of Lancaster. For Margaret, the distance was agony. Every rumor of Yorkist retaliation filled her with dread. Every winter storm that lashed the Welsh coast carried the fear that she might lose him to sickness, shipwreck, or betrayal. She could not hold him, could not protect him with her arms. And so she protected him with her mind, with careful alliances, with whispered diplomacy, with prayers uttered at dawn and dusk. To the world, Margaret Stafford was a dutiful wife, a pious woman, a quiet figure at the edges of court intrigue. But beneath that surface, she was already shaping herself into something more dangerous, a strategist. Her son's life was her cause, her faith, her weapon. If England's storms had stolen her childhood, they had also forged her resolve. And though the white rose now sat upon the throne, the red had not yet withered.
The 1472nd brought a cruel twist of fate. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as if fortune might smile on Lancaster again. Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker himself, turned against Edward IV and restored the feeble Henry VI to the throne. Margaret Beaufort, watching carefully, must have felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps her son's bloodline still had a future. But the dream was short-lived. In 1471, at Barnet and Tewkesbury, Yorkist steel crushed Lancaster forever. Warwick was killed. Henry VI's son, the last direct Lancastrian prince, was cut down in battle, and the king himself was quietly murdered in the Tower. The Red Rose was all but extinguished. All but one. Henry Tudor, Margaret's boy, now barely 14, suddenly became the last flicker of Lancastrian legitimacy. That made him more valuable than ever, and far more dangerous. To the Yorkist king, Edward IV, Henry was not a child, but a threat, a banner around which enemies could rally. Jasper Tudor understood this too well. The boy could not remain in Wales. Capture meant certain death. And so, on a storm-lashed night in September 1471, Henry was spirited onto a ship at Tenby. Waves crashed against the harbor walls, sails strained, and as the vessel slipped into the dark waters, it carried with it not only a frightened boy, but the last surviving hope of a dynasty. His destination, Brittany, a small duchy caught between the great powers of France and England, exile. Margaret was not there to see him go. The news reached her only after he had crossed the Channel. Imagine her grief. For years, her motherhood had been confined to letters, tokens, and brief meetings. Now, even that fragile connection was severed by sea and war. She did not know if she would ever lay eyes on him again. For a mother whose body had nearly been broken to bring him into the world, the separation was unbearable. Yet she did not collapse. Instead, her grief hardened into steel. If she could not protect him with her arms, she would fight for him with her mind. Her husband, Henry Stafford, died not long after, worn down by wounds and the endless turmoil of shifting allegiances. Margaret, still only in her late 20s, found herself widowed again. This time she chose her next marriage with precision. In 1472 she wed Thomas Stanley, one of the most calculating and formidable men in England. Stanley was infamous for his ability to change sides at the very last moment, always ending up on the winning team. His family commanded vast estates and private armies in the northwest. To some, he was a serpent. To Margaret, he was exactly what she needed: protection, power, and access. The union was no love match. It was a pact between two survivors. Margaret brought prestige Beaufort blood, Lancaster's last hope. Stanley brought muscle, wealth, and political cover. Together, they formed one of the most pragmatic alliances of the Wars of the Roses. Meanwhile, Henry Tudor grew into manhood in exile. In Brittany, he lived under the watchful eye of Duke Francis II, a ruler torn between pleasing France and England. To the Duke, Henry was a pawn, a bargaining chip to be traded when it suited his interests. For young Henry, exile was a strange mix of privilege and peril. He was treated as a prince, but always under threat of betrayal. Mother and son clung to each other through coded letters. They wrote in riddles, in invisible inks, in carefully chosen phrases that could pass as harmless if intercepted. Margaret sent gifts when she could: books, clothing, tokens of love, but above all, she sent words. Words to remind him that he was not forgotten, that he was England's rightful heir, that his mother's prayers and plans would one day see him crowned. And while her son grew in exile, Margaret built an intelligence network in England. Merchants, clerics, servants, and nobles whispered news into her ear. She cultivated friendships with women across the divides of Lancaster and York, understanding that where men made enemies, women often found ways to endure. She even maintained contact with Elizabeth Woodville, Queen of Edward IV, balancing loyalty and secrecy with exquisite care. To her enemies, she appeared merely pious, quiet, devout, harmless. In truth, she was sharpening her skills as one of the most dangerous political players of her age. Every move was calculated, every alliance weighed, every silence deliberate. By the late 1472, the Wars of the Roses seemed to have settled. Edward IV ruled securely, the Yorkist dynasty entrenched. Margaret's son was far away, living in the shadow of betrayal. Yet she never stopped believing. She had survived widowhood, separation, and despair. She had seen kings toppled and dynasties destroyed. And she had learned the most important lesson of all. Survival was not enough. One day, Henry would return. And when he did, Margaret Beaufort would be ready. In 1483, England was shaken once more. Edward IV, the Yorkist king, died suddenly at just 40 years old, leaving his crown to his 12-year-old son, Edward V. For a brief moment, it seemed the succession might pass peacefully. But in the world Margaret Beaufort had come to know so well, peace was always an illusion. The boy never wore the crown. His uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, seized him and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, and placed them in the Tower of London for their protection. They were never seen alive again. Whispers spread like wildfire that Richard had murdered his nephews to clear his own path to the throne. And so, Richard III was crowned, his reign born in suspicion and blood. For many, Richard's ruthlessness was shocking. For Margaret, it was opportunity. She knew the Yorkist claim was now stained. The disappearance of the princes in the Tower turned public opinion against Richard. Rumors spread in taverns, in markets, in noble halls. If Richard could kill his brother's sons, who was safe? Into this vacuum, Margaret inserted a name her sons laugh. Henry Tudor, exiled in Brittany, the last viable Lancastrian heir. The gamble was audacious. She, a woman bound in marriage to Thomas Stanley, a man loyal, at least publicly, to Richard, began to plot rebellion. She reached out to John Morton, Bishop of Ely, one of the shrewdest minds in England. Together they built a conspiracy that stretched across the kingdom. Messages traveled by candlelight, hidden in hollowed-out books, disguised in the folds of merchant ledgers. But Margaret was not reckless. She knew that to overthrow Richard, she could not rely on Lancastrian blood alone. The country had grown weary of endless war. She needed Yorkist support as well. And so she conceived of a brilliant union. Her son Henry would marry Elizabeth of York, eldest daughter of the late Edward IV. Red rose and white rose, Lancaster and York united in one crown. It was a promise that could end 30 years of bloodshed. The plan was dangerous, almost impossible. Henry would invade from Brittany with foreign backing, while uprisings within England rose to meet him. Timing was everything, but betrayal came swiftly. The rebellion of 1483 collapsed before Henry could even land. His ships, battered by storms, turned back. His would-be allies in England were hunted down and executed. The gallows were busy that winter, and the air was thick with the smell of fear. Richard's vengeance fell heavily, but not fatally, upon Margaret. Her role was uncovered. She might have faced death herself, but her husband, Thomas Stanley, intervened. Richard could not afford to alienate a man who commanded thousands of soldiers. So Margaret was spared execution, but punished. She was placed under house arrest, her titles stripped, her movements watched. And yet even under God she did not stop. House arrest was no prison for her mind. Letters still passed in and out, carried by loyal servants and sympathetic priests. Her household chapel became more than a place of prayer. It became the quiet chamber where rebellion was nurtured. To her jailers she appeared pious, submissive, humbled. But behind every whispered prayer lay a strategy. Behind every sigh of obedience lay a conspiracy. Richard III ruled, but he ruled under a cloud. His reign was haunted by the whispers of child murder and rebellion, and in the shadows, Margaret waited, patient as a hunter. She knew her son's time would come. Because England, weary of treachery and blood, longed for a figure who could unite the roses. And Margaret, widow, mother, conspirator, believed with unshakable certainty that God had chosen Henry for that role. She had lost her childhood, her health, and her freedom. But she had not lost her resolve. Richard wore the crown, but Margaret Beaufort was already sharpening the dagger that would take it from him. August 1485. The fate of England stood balanced on a blade. From exile in Brittany, Henry Tudor had returned at last, sailing into Milford Haven with a modest army of French mercenaries and loyal exiles. His claim was tenuous, his forces outnumbered, his chances uncertain. But behind him stood the unwavering will of his mother, Margaret Beaufort, whose years of plotting had built the fragile scaffolding of rebellion into something that could no longer be ignored. The armies met at Bosworth Field on the 22nd of August. Richard III, armored in black, rode at the head of thousands of hardened Yorkist soldiers. Henry Tudor, cautious and untested, carried not just a banner but the desperate hopes of Lancaster's last survivors. And in between them, watching with keen eyes, stood Thomas Stanley and his brother William, commanders of a massive force whose loyalty could decide the day. Richard believed the Stanleys were his. Margaret knew better. For years, she had cultivated her husband's ambition, appealed to his pragmatism, and whispered of futures where their family would sit at the very center of power. And so, when the crucial moment came, the Stanleys turned not to Richard, but to Henry. Their betrayal broke the Yorkist lines. Richard, fierce to the last, spurred his horse directly toward Henry, determined to end the rebellion with his own sword. Chroniclers say he cut down men in his path, his crown glinting in the sunday. But he was surrounded, dragged from his mount, and struck down in the mud. His body, battered and stripped, was carried ignominiously from the field. The last Plantagenet king lay dead, and the crown was found tangled in a thorn bush. That crown was placed upon Henry's head. Against every odd, Margaret's son was king, Henry VII of England. The Tudor dynasty was born. For Margaret, the triumph was not one of celebration but of vindication. Nearly 3 decades earlier, she had screamed in agony as she brought Henry into the world. Since then, she had survived widowhood, near death, political exile, house arrest, and the contempt of men who underestimated her. Every prayer, every alliance, every risk had led to this moment. Her son was crowned because she had willed it so. As my lady the king's mother, Margaret wielded a power few women in England had ever known. She maintained her independence from her husband Stanley, managing her vast estates and presiding over one of the most sophisticated political households in the realm. She guided her son in kingship, offering counsel shrewd enough that some whispered she was the true architect of the early Tudor state. She arranged his marriage to Elizabeth of York, uniting the red and white roses in a single crown, ending the wars that had bled England dry. But her influence was not only political. Margaret was a patron of learning, founding colleges at Cambridge, sponsoring the printing of devotional works, and encouraging scholarship. Piety remained the cornerstone of her life. She rose before dawn for prayer, wore simple clothes despite her wealth, and lived with an austerity that astonished her contemporaries. Yet even her piety was sharpened by pragmatism. To her, faith was both devotion and duty, both salvation and strategy. When Henry VII died in 1509, Margaret lived just long enough to see her grandson, Henry VIII, crowned. Days later, she herself passed away, her life's mission complete. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, where her black marble tomb still rests, carved with a serene effigy of the woman whose iron will had reshaped a kingdom. The cost of her triumph cannot be measured in simple terms. She had given her body, broken by childbirth at 13. She had sacrificed her motherhood, separated from her son for years. She had risked her freedom, her life, her soul, in conspiracies that could have ended at the scaffold. But from her suffering, a dynasty was born. And perhaps that is the truest measure of Margaret Beaufort. She was not merely a mother, not merely a widow, not merely a pawn of politics. She was the silent architect of a new England, a woman who forged destiny from despair, and whose story still lingers in the cold stones of Pembroke Castle. where a girl's scream once echoed into the night and became the first cry of a dynasty.